On the evening of May 19, 2012, inside a luxury apartment in the Morumbi district of São Paulo, Brazil, a man who had inherited one of the country's most successful food empires would die under circumstances that would shock the nation. His name was Marcos Kitano Matsunaga, and his death would not be a simple tragedy. It would become one of the most shocking and widely discussed murder cases in Brazilian criminal history, exposing the dark underbelly of wealth, control, and desperation that can exist even in the most privileged corners of society. If you appreciate in-depth, respectful investigations into Brazil's most compelling and complex cases, please like this video and subscribe to Brazil's Crime Vault. It really helps us bring more cases to light, and your support means everything to us as we continue documenting these stories with care, precision, and absolute respect for the victims and their families. To understand the tragedy that would unfold on that May evening, we must first understand who Marcos Matsunaga was. He was not simply a wealthy businessman. He was the heir to a Brazilian empire. The Yoki food company, founded by his grandfather Yoshio Kitano, had become one of Brazil's largest and most recognizable food brands. The company's name itself was a tribute to its founder, and for decades, Yoki had been a household name across Brazil, producing everything from cooking oils to seasonings to instant foods. By the time Marcos inherited his position, Yoki was generating hundreds of millions of dollars in annual revenue. In 2011, just 1 year before his death, the Matsunaga family made the decision to sell Yoki to General Mills, an American multinational corporation, for approximately 1.75 billion Brazilian reais, a staggering sum that cemented the family's wealth for generations to come. Marcos, as one of the heirs to this empire, was not just wealthy. He was extraordinarily wealthy, with access to resources, properties, and a lifestyle that most people could only imagine. But wealth, as this case would demonstrate, does not protect against human tragedy. Marcos Matsunaga was a man in his late 40s, living in a luxury apartment in one of São Paulo's most exclusive neighborhoods. He had been married before, and from that first marriage he had a child. However, his personal life was far more complicated than his business success might suggest. According to court records and police investigations, Marcos had a pattern of infidelity. He was known to engage in relationships outside of his marriage, and he did not always attempt to hide these affairs from his spouse. This behavior would become central to understanding the events that led to his death. It was through an unconventional meeting that Marcos would encounter the woman who would ultimately be convicted of his murder. Her name was Elize Araújo Kitano, though she had also used the professional name Kelly when she worked as an escort. Elize came from a very different background than Marcos. She was a former nurse who had turned to sex work to finance her law school education, a decision that reflected both her ambition and her desperation to improve her circumstances. The two met on M-Class, a website that connected wealthy clients with escorts, and what began as a transactional relationship would evolve into something far more complex and ultimately far more dangerous. According to Elize's own account, given years later in interviews and in the Netflix documentary series that would chronicle this case, she and Marcos began a relationship that lasted approximately 3 years before his death. During this time, they lived together in his luxury apartment. Elize became pregnant with Marcos's child, and they had a daughter together. On the surface, it appeared that Elize had achieved what she was seeking, a way out of her precarious financial situation, a relationship with a wealthy man, and the opportunity to build a family. However, the reality of their life together was far darker than appearances suggested. According to Elize's testimony and statements to police, the relationship between her and Marcos was characterized by control, manipulation, and abuse. She described instances of verbal abuse where Marcos would demean her, remind her of her past as an escort, and use her background against her in arguments. More significantly, Elize claimed that Marcos had threatened to take full custody of their daughter if she ever attempted to leave him. This threat was particularly devastating because it meant that Elize, who had built her life around her child, faced the prospect of losing her daughter if she tried to escape the relationship. The threat of losing custody of a child is one of the most powerful forms of control that can be wielded in a relationship. And according to Elize, Marcos wielded it deliberately and repeatedly. The tension in their relationship intensified as Marcos continued his pattern of infidelity. According to police reports and court documents, Marcos was having an affair, and Elize became aware of it. In fact, Elize hired a private investigator to gather evidence of his infidelity, evidence that would prove crucial to understanding what happened on the night of May 19, 2012. The private investigator provided Elize with documentation of Marcos's affair, concrete proof of his betrayal. This evidence would become the catalyst for the events that followed. On the evening of May 19, 2012, Marcos and Elize were at home together in their apartment. According to Elize's account, which she would later provide to police and which would be presented in court, the couple had ordered pizza for dinner. Security camera footage from the building captured Marcos leaving the apartment to collect the pizza from the delivery person. When he returned, the couple sat down to eat, and Elize confronted him with the evidence of his infidelity that the private investigator had provided. The confrontation escalated into an argument. According to Elize's testimony, Marcos became angry and verbally abusive. She claimed that he physically assaulted her during this argument and that he reiterated his threat to take full custody of their daughter. In that moment, according to Elize's account, she felt cornered. She was trapped in a relationship with a man who controlled her through threats, who abused her verbally and physically, and who had made it clear that if she tried to leave, she would lose her child. The apartment they shared contained multiple firearms, weapons that Marcos kept for personal security and protection. In what Elize would describe as a moment of desperation and fear for her safety and her future with her daughter, she retrieved one of these firearms from another room in the apartment. According to police reports and forensic evidence, Marcos died as a result of a fatal gunshot wound during this confrontation. What happened next would shock investigators and the Brazilian public. Rather than immediately calling for help or contacting police, Elize made a series of decisions that would transform this case from a potential crime of passion into something far more calculated and deliberate in the eyes of the law. According to police reports and forensic evidence, Elize proceeded to dispose of Marcos's remains. She placed them into multiple suitcases and bags. Over the course of several days, she transported these containers to various locations outside of São Paulo, disposing of the remains in different areas. The discovery of these remains, scattered across multiple locations in the suburbs of São Paulo, would be one of the most shocking aspects of this case and would dominate Brazilian media coverage for months. The investigation that followed was swift and methodical. The São Paulo Police Department, specifically the state-level investigative police known as the Polícia Civil, launched an intensive investigation. Forensic experts examined the remains and the apartment. They collected evidence from the crime scene, including biological evidence, trace evidence, and physical evidence. They interviewed neighbors, building staff, and anyone who might have information about the couple's relationship or the events of that evening. The investigation revealed that Marcos had died from a fatal gunshot wound and that the subsequent disposal of his remains had occurred in the apartment. Forensic evidence suggested that the disposal process had taken place over a period of time, indicating that this was not a spontaneous act, but rather a deliberate process. Within days of the discovery of Marcos's remains, Elize was arrested. According to police reports, she confessed to the crime. In her confession, she provided details about what had happened, about the argument, about her fear, and about her actions in the hours and days following the shooting. The police inquiry that followed resulted in Elize being indicted by the São Paulo Police Department for homicídio qualificado, the Brazilian legal equivalent of first-degree murder or aggravated homicide. This charge carries significantly harsher penalties than simple homicide because it involves what Brazilian law considers qualifying circumstances, factors that make the crime more serious, such as cruelty, premeditation, or the use of means that put the victim in a position of helplessness. The case against Elize was built on multiple pieces of evidence. There was her confession to police, which she later partially recanted or reframed in interviews. There was forensic evidence from the crime scene, including biological evidence that placed her at the scene and connected her to the disposal of remains. There was the testimony of neighbors and building staff about the couple's relationship and the events surrounding the crime. There was the evidence of the private investigator regarding Marcos's infidelity, which established motive, and there was the physical evidence of the suitcases, the locations where remains were found, and the timeline of events that investigators were able to reconstruct. The case also raised important questions about the nature of the crime itself. The prosecution argued that the disposal of Marcos's body and the subsequent transportation of remains to multiple locations demonstrated a level of deliberation that elevated this beyond a simple crime of passion. They argued that even if Elize had shot Marcos in a moment of fear or anger, the subsequent actions, the careful disposal and transportation of remains, demonstrated premeditation and a calculated attempt to cover up the crime. This distinction was crucial because it affected the severity of the charges and the potential sentences that Elize could face. The trial of Elize Matsunaga took place in the Brazilian court system, specifically in what is known as a tribunal do júri, a jury trial in the homicide court. This is a significant aspect of the Brazilian legal system. In cases of homicide, the defendant has the right to be tried by a jury of ordinary citizens, similar to the jury trial system in the United States. The jury is responsible for determining guilt or innocence based on the evidence presented by both the prosecution and the defense. This means that Elize's fate would be decided not by a judge, but by a panel of ordinary Brazilian citizens who would hear the evidence and make a determination about whether she was guilty of the crime she was accused of. The trial generated enormous media attention in Brazil. The case had all the elements that capture public fascination: wealth, infidelity, domestic violence, a shocking crime, and a woman from a humble background who had married into extraordinary wealth. The trial was covered extensively by Brazilian media outlets, and the case became a topic of intense public debate. People discussed whether Elize was a victim of abuse who had acted in self-defense, or whether she was a calculating murderer who had killed her husband for financial gain or out of jealousy. The case raised important questions about domestic violence in Brazil, about the rights of women in abusive relationships, and about how the legal system should respond to cases where abuse and violence intersect. During the trial, Elize's defense presented arguments about the abuse she had suffered in her relationship with Marcos. They presented evidence of his infidelity, his verbal abuse, and his threats regarding custody of their daughter. They argued that Elize had acted in self-defense, that she had feared for her safety and for her ability to maintain custody of her child, and that her actions, while tragic, were understandable given the circumstances she faced. The defense also highlighted Elize's background, her work as a nurse, her efforts to pursue a law degree, her status as a single mother who had been trying to improve her circumstances. They painted a picture of a vulnerable woman who had been exploited and abused by a wealthy man who used his resources and power to control her. The prosecution, however, presented a different narrative. They argued that regardless of any abuse Elize may have suffered, the act of shooting Marcos and the subsequent disposal of his remains demonstrated a level of deliberation and planning that went far beyond self-defense. They argued that if Elize had feared for her safety, she had other options. She could have left the apartment, she could have called police, she could have sought help from family or friends. Instead, they argued, she chose to kill her husband and then methodically dispose of evidence. The prosecution presented forensic evidence, timeline evidence, and expert testimony to support their case that this was a premeditated murder, not a spontaneous act of self-defense. The jury deliberated carefully, understanding the weight of their decision. In 2013, they reached a verdict. Elize Matsunaga was found guilty of homicidio qualificado, aggravated homicide. She was sentenced to 19 years in prison. This sentence reflected the jury's determination that while they may have understood the circumstances that led to the crime, they believed that Elize's actions, particularly the deliberate disposal and transportation of remains to multiple locations, demonstrated a level of premeditation and calculation that warranted a significant prison sentence. However, the legal battle did not end with this. Verdict. Over the years following her conviction, Elize's legal team filed multiple appeals and motions for reconsideration. They argued that her sentence was too harsh, that she deserved a new trial, that evidence had been mishandled, or that her conviction was unjust given the circumstances of abuse she had suffered. The case wound through Brazil's appellate system, with various courts reviewing the evidence and the verdict. Each development in the appeals process generated renewed media attention and public debate about the case. In 2021, nearly a decade after her conviction, the case received renewed international attention when Netflix released a 4-part documentary series titled Elize Matsunaga, Once Upon a Crime. The documentary featured exclusive interviews with Elize herself, conducted while she was serving her sentence in a Brazilian prison. In these interviews, Elize provided her own account of her relationship with Marcos, the abuse she suffered, and the events of the night he died. The documentary also included interviews with investigators, legal experts, and others involved in the case. The release of the Netflix series reignited public debate about the case, with viewers and commentators divided about whether Elize was a victim of abuse who had acted in self-defense or whether she was a calculating murderer. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Netflix documentary was how it presented Elize's perspective in her own words. She spoke about her childhood, her family background, her decision to work as an escort to finance her education, and her hopes for a better life. She described her relationship with Marcos in detail, discussing both the positive aspects and the controlling and abusive behavior she experienced. She talked about her love for her daughter and her fear of losing custody, and she discussed the events of May 19, 2012, from her perspective. The documentary did not shy away from difficult questions, but it also presented Elize as a complex human being rather than a simple villain or victim. The case of Marcos Matsunaga and Elize Araújo Kitano raises profound questions about Brazilian society and the legal system. It demonstrates how wealth and privilege do not protect families from violence, abuse, or tragedy. It shows how relationships characterized by control and manipulation can escalate to the point of irreversible harm. It highlights the complex intersection of domestic violence, self-defense, and criminal responsibility in the Brazilian legal system. The case also raises questions about how society should respond to women who have suffered abuse and who take extreme actions in response to that abuse. Should the law recognize abuse as a mitigating factor that reduces culpability? Or should the law hold individuals responsible for their actions regardless of the circumstances that led to those actions? The Yoki company, which had been at the center of the Matsunaga family's wealth, continued to operate under the ownership of General Mills after the sale. The company that had been built by Marcos's grandfather and that had made the family extraordinarily wealthy became, in a sense, a footnote to the tragedy that unfolded within the family. The wealth that the company had generated did not prevent the violence, the abuse, or the tragedy that occurred within the walls of a luxury apartment in São Paulo. For the Matsunaga family, the loss of Marcos was irreversible. For Elize, the consequences of her actions have been a prison sentence that will define the remainder of her life. For their daughter, the tragedy meant growing up without her father and with her mother imprisoned. For Brazilian society, the case became a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about relationships, power, wealth, and the potential for violence that exists even in the most exclusive neighborhoods of the country's largest city. Today, the Matsunaga case remains a reference point in discussions about crime in Brazil, about domestic violence, and about the Brazilian legal system. It is studied in law schools, analyzed by criminologists and legal scholars, and remembered by the public as a stark reminder that tragedy can strike anywhere, regardless of wealth or social status. The case continues to generate debate about the nature of self-defense, the role of abuse in criminal cases, and how the legal system should balance accountability with compassion for those who have suffered. The investigation into Marcos Matsunaga's death also highlighted the capabilities of Brazilian law enforcement. The Polícia Civil demonstrated sophisticated forensic techniques, careful evidence collection, and methodical investigative work. The case became a model for how complex homicide investigations should be conducted, and it was studied by law enforcement agencies across Brazil as an example of thorough and professional police work. As for Elize Matsunaga, she remains incarcerated in the Brazilian prison system. Her legal team continues to pursue appeals and motions for sentence reduction or reconsideration. She has become a controversial figure in Brazil. Some view her as a victim of abuse who acted in desperation, while others view her as a calculating murderer who killed her husband and then attempted to cover up the crime. The truth, as is often the case in complex criminal cases, likely lies somewhere in the middle, in the gray area between victimhood and culpability, between desperation and deliberation. The case of Marcos Matsunaga and Elize Araújo Kitano will likely continue to be discussed, debated, and analyzed for years to come. It is a case that forces us to confront difficult questions about human nature, about relationships, about power and control, and about the systems we have in place to protect people from harm and to hold people accountable for their actions. If this investigation resonated with you, please like the video and subscribe to Brazil's Crime Vault. Your support helps us document more cases with care, precision, and absolute respect for all those affected by these tragedies. Share your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of this case struck you most? What questions does it raise for you about justice, about abuse, about the legal system? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next investigation.